Stephen Hawking was born into a world that was already tired. It was the middle of the 20th century. Britain was still carrying the quiet weight of war. Buildings stood, but many of them felt older than they were. People spoke carefully. Life moved forward, but without hurry. Stephen was born into a family that valued thinking more than noise. Books were common objects. Questions were welcome. Silence was not treated as a problem. He was not born into greatness. There were no early headlines. No childhood stories about a genius rewriting equations at the dinner table. In fact, by many accounts, he was fairly ordinary. At school, Stephen was not the fastest. He was not the most disciplined. Teachers did not expect much from him at first. Some even thought he might struggle later in life. But there was something quieter happening. Stephen liked to sit with ideas longer than other children. He watched how things worked. He took apart clocks, radios, small machines, not to break them, but to see what lived inside. While others rushed to answers, he stayed with questions. There is a kind of attention that does not announce itself. It does not feel urgent. It simply stays. Stephen had that kind of attention. He enjoyed humor, dry humor, the kind that arrives a second later than expected, the kind that makes people realize they have been thinking too quickly. Time, even then, seemed to move differently around him, not faster, not slower, just steadier. He was born on January 8, 1942, exactly 300 years after the death of Galileo. This coincidence would later be mentioned often, but at the time, it meant nothing. History rarely announces itself when it arrives. Stephen grew up during a period when science was changing its shape. Old certainties were fading. The universe was becoming larger, stranger, less predictable. But as a child, none of that mattered yet. What mattered were small things: curiosity, patterns, the quiet satisfaction of understanding how one piece connected to another. He built models with friends, crude machines made from scraps, things that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. Failure did not discourage him. It simply became part of the process. There is something important about a childhood without pressure, without the need to be exceptional too early, without the feeling that time is running out. Stephen had that gift. Time in those early years felt open, unmeasured, unthreatening. He did not yet know that time would later become one of the central questions of his life. For now, it simply passed, day by day, quietly, and Stephen watched it go by. As Stephen moved into his teenage years, life did not suddenly sharpen into focus. There was no moment where everything became clear. No sudden realization that he was meant for something large or important. Things continued much as they had before. School, friends, long stretches of time that felt ordinary. At St. Albans School, Stephen was still not at the top of his class. He did well enough, but not well enough to stand out. Some students worked harder, some memorized faster, some followed instructions more cleanly. Stephen did something else. He thought sideways. When presented with a problem, he did not rush to solve it. He tried to understand why it existed in the first place. He wanted to know what assumptions were hiding underneath it. This sometimes made him seem slow, or distracted, or uninterested, but he was paying attention in his own way. Outside of class, he spent time with friends building things: simple computers made from scraps, small experiments, mechanical puzzles. There was laughter in those moments, debate, a shared sense of curiosity. Stephen was social in his own quiet style. He enjoyed conversation, especially conversations that wandered, There was humor in him, a subtle confidence, not the confidence of someone certain about the future, but the confidence of someone comfortable, not knowing. As university approached, expectations remained modest. No one predicted the path ahead with precision. There was no dramatic pressure to succeed. No sense that time was closing in. Stephen himself did not feel rushed. He applied to Oxford almost casually, studied physics not because it promised greatness, but because it felt interesting. At Oxford, something began to change, though slowly. Surrounded by other curious minds, Stephen found himself drifting closer to ideas that felt larger. Not because he was chasing ambition, but because his attention kept settling there. He worked efficiently, sometimes lazily by his own admission, but when it mattered, he focused deeply. He graduated with strong results, despite not following a rigid path. Time still felt generous then. There was an assumption, shared by everyone around him, that life would unfold in a familiar order. Study, work, years stretching forward in a predictable line. Stephen did not question this assumption. He did not need to. The future still felt wide open, unmeasured, unthreatening. And so he moved forward without urgency, without fear, without knowing how differently time would soon behave. Just a young man, thinking quietly, as life continued on its steady way. Stephen's early 20s arrived without ceremony. Life was still moving forward in expected ways. Graduate studies, new ideas, long conversations that stretched late into the evening. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual, but small things began to shift. At first, they were easy to ignore. A stumble while walking, an awkward fall that felt out of character, hands that did not always do exactly what he asked of them. These moments did not arrive with meaning attached to them. They felt like accidents, like clumsiness, like fatigue. Stephen laughed them off. He was young. Young people fall. Young people misjudge steps. There was no reason to turn these moments into questions, but they continued. Walking became slightly less reliable. Movement required a bit more attention than before. Simple actions demanded more effort. Not enough to alarm anyone, not enough to stop daily life, just enough to feel different. Stephen was still thinking deeply, still engaging with ideas that felt vast and abstract, still moving forward intellectually. Meanwhile, the body began to hesitate. This contrast was subtle at first, a quiet imbalance between mind and movement. Friends noticed before he did. They mentioned it casually, asked if he was tired, if he was feeling well. Stephen brushed it aside. There is a natural resistance humans have to the idea that something fundamental might be changing. We prefer explanations that allow life to continue unchanged. We choose ordinary reasons, temporary ones. During this time, Stephen also began to feel something else. Not pain, not illness, but a faint uncertainty. The sense that time was no longer moving as smoothly through the body as it was through thought. The mind raced ahead. The body lagged behind. This mismatch did not yet frighten him. It simply puzzled him. He was still planning, still imagining years ahead, still assuming continuity. And yet, in quiet moments, there was a growing awareness that something was drifting out of alignment. Life did not stop. It rarely does. Classes continued. Ideas developed. Days passed. But beneath the surface of normality, a slow question was forming. Not spoken aloud, not fully shaped, just a gentle uncertainty waiting for a name. The answer did not arrive suddenly. It came the way many life-altering truths do, through appointments, through tests, through waiting rooms where time feels slightly heavier than usual. Stephen was in his early 20s when doctors began to look more closely. What had seemed like clumsiness now required explanation. The process was slow, uncertain, filled with technical language that did not yet feel personal. Until one day, it did. The diagnosis was amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a condition that affects the nerve cells responsible for movement, a condition that progresses. The words themselves were clinical, almost distant. What followed them was not. Doctors explained timelines. They spoke in probabilities. They used careful voices. They said he might have a few years. 2, perhaps. Time, which had once felt open and unthreatening, suddenly became measured. Not in hours or days, but in expectations. For many people, this is the moment when everything collapses. Plans evaporate. The future narrows. Stephen reacted differently, not dramatically, not heroically, quietly. He later said that, at first, he felt stunned. Numb, disconnected from what he was being told. It did not feel real yet. When reality did arrive, it did not come as panic. It came as a strange stillness. There is something unusual about being told your future. Most people move through life without knowing its outline. Suddenly, Stephen was handed one. And oddly, it simplified things. If time was limited, then there was less reason to waste it on worry. This did not mean optimism. It did not mean denial. It meant clarity. He still had work to do, ideas to explore, questions that mattered to him. The body had begun to fail, but the mind felt as active as ever. In some ways, the diagnosis sharpened his attention. Small distractions fell away. Petty concerns lost their weight. What remained were the essentials: thinking, understanding, being present with what still worked. Time had changed shape. It was no longer endless, but it was still available, and Stephen chose to use it. Not loudly, not defiantly, just steadily. As life continued, now under a different set of assumptions. After the diagnosis, life did not reorganize itself all at once. There was no clean dividing line between before and after. Instead, there was overlap. Stephen continued his studies. He continued his relationships. He continued living inside ordinary days. At the same time, his body continued to change. Movement became more deliberate. Walking required assistance more often. Tasks that once felt automatic now required attention. This shift did not happen dramatically. It unfolded quietly over months and years. What changed most was rhythm. Life began to slow, not because Stephen chose it, but because his body insisted on it. At first, this slowing felt like interruption, a delay, an inconvenience. But gradually, it became a new pace. Stephen adapted without announcing it. He learned how to plan around fatigue, how to conserve energy, how to let others help without turning it into a statement. There is a subtle skill involved in accepting help without surrendering independence. He developed that skill. During this time, he married. He became a father. He entered into daily routines that had nothing to do with cosmology or physics. Family life has its own tempo. Meals, conversations, small obligations that repeat. These ordinary structures mattered. They grounded him. Even as his physical abilities declined, his sense of participation in life remained intact. He was not waiting for life to happen. He was already inside it. There were frustrations, of course, moments when the body felt like a limitation rather than a companion. But Stephen did not frame his life as a struggle. He framed it as a situation, one that required adjustment, one that demanded patience. Thought became increasingly central, not as an escape, but as a place where effort still translated into motion, where attention still produced results. This period of his life was not defined by triumph or despair. It was defined by learning how to exist within constraints without allowing those constraints to shrink the inner world. Time moved differently now, slower in the body, steady in the mind, and Stephen learned how to live comfortably inside that difference. By this stage of his life, movement was no longer something Stephen could take for granted. Walking required assistance. Simple actions demanded planning. The body, once cooperative, now asked for patience, but something else was happening at the same time. His inner world was growing larger. As physical space around him narrowed, mental space seemed to expand. He spent long hours thinking, not in a strained way, not with force. Thinking became a place he could still move freely. From a chair, from a desk, from quiet rooms, Stephen began to travel farther than most people ever would. Not through cities or landscapes, but through time itself. He thought about the beginning of the universe, about moments when time may not have existed at all, about regions of space where the usual rules quietly fail. Black holes were not, to him, violent or dramatic objects. They were questions. What happens to time when gravity becomes overwhelming? What happens to information when nothing can escape? What happens to order at the edge of collapse? These ideas were not approached with urgency. They unfolded slowly, patiently. He was not racing anyone. There is a particular calm that comes from thinking about things that are vastly larger than the self. When you consider stars that live for billions of years, or universes that may exist beyond our own personal timelines soften, Stephen's physical limitations did not disappear. They remained present, persistent, but they no longer defined the boundary of his life. The room he sat in mattered less than the ideas passing through him. The chair mattered less than the concepts taking shape. In some quiet way, the universe became more accessible to him than the space immediately around his body. This did not make daily life easy. It did not remove frustration or difficulty, but it introduced balance. Where the body slowed, thought expanded. Where movement contracted, imagination widened. Time itself became something he could examine rather than simply experience. And from that still position, Stephen continued moving, not outward, but inward, toward the deepest structures of reality. As the years passed, the changes continued, quietly and steadily. Movement became more limited. Control over small muscles weakened, and eventually, speech itself began to fade. At first, it was subtle. Words took longer to form. Sentences required more effort to complete. Conversation slowed. For someone whose life was built around ideas, this was not just a physical loss. It was a shift in how presence was expressed. Then came the moment when Stephen lost his natural voice entirely. Silence arrived where sound used to be. For many people, this would feel like disappearance, like being pushed to the edge of the world of others. But again, adaptation followed. Technology stepped in, not dramatically, but practically. A computer system allowed him to select words. Slowly at first, later more efficiently. A synthetic voice spoke for him. At first, it sounded unfamiliar, flat, mechanical. But something interesting happened over time. That voice became associated with him. Its rhythm, its tone, its steady delivery. people began to recognize it as his. The human mind is remarkably flexible about what it accepts as identity. A voice, it turns out, does not have to come from vocal cords to feel personal. Stephen continued teaching, continued giving lectures, continued participating in conversations. The speed was different. The method had changed, but the content remained unmistakably his. There is something quietly profound about this period of his life. As physical expression narrowed, communication became more deliberate. Every sentence required intention. Every word had to be chosen. In a strange way, this made speech more precise. Less filler, less waste. Thoughts emerged carefully, one at a time. The world adjusted around him, slowly learning to listen in a new way. And Stephen remained present within it, not diminished, not withdrawn, just expressed differently. The loss of voice did not end communication. It simply changed its shape. And time, as always, continued on. For a long time, Stephen's work moved mostly within academic circles. Papers were read by specialists. Ideas traveled slowly. Through conferences and journals, recognition, when it came, was measured and contained. Then something shifted. Not because Stephen changed his approach, but because the world began to look more closely. His ideas about the universe, about time and space, started to reach beyond universities. A book was written, not loudly, not dramatically. It was meant to explain difficult ideas in a way that did not demand expertise, a way that respected curiosity. When a brief history of time was published, it did something unusual. People bought it. They placed it on bedside tables. They carried it with them. Many did not finish it. That was never the point. The book became a symbol of quiet curiosity, of wanting to understand, even without mastery. Stephen became recognizable, not because of his appearance, not because of spectacle, but because he represented something rare. A person thinking calmly about the largest questions available to humans. Fame arrived without changing his daily rhythm very much. His body still moved slowly. His days were still shaped by care, assistance, routine. But now there were interviews, invitations, public attention. Stephen did not chase it. He accepted it with the same dry humor he had always carried, aware of its strangeness, slightly amused by it. There is a difference between seeking attention and allowing attention to pass through you. Stephen seemed to understand that difference intuitively. He became, unintentionally, a symbol of science, of persistence, of thought continuing under constraint. But inside, life remained ordinary. Meals, family, work. Fame did not erase limitation, and limitation did not erase presence. The outer world now paid attention, while the inner world remained steady. Two realities coexisting quietly. Time continued moving forward. And Stephen, now known far beyond the rooms where he thought, remained the same person he had always been, thinking, observing, letting attention rest on what mattered. Behind the public image, life continued in small, human ways. Stephen was not a symbol inside his own home. He was a person with preferences, habits, and moods. He enjoyed humor, especially when it was understated. Dry remarks, unexpected timing, jokes that unfolded slowly, then landed quietly. He could be stubborn, opinionated, firm in his views. Relationships were not idealized or polished. They were real. There were moments of closeness, moments of distance, periods of harmony and periods of strain. Family life brought structure to his days. Meals happened at certain times. Care routines shaped the hours. Conversations unfolded at a slower pace. This ordinariness mattered. It prevented his life from becoming abstract. It anchored him in the present. Even as people spoke about him in grand terms, his daily experience was grounded in simple realities. Getting comfortable, waiting, responding, listening. Life was not reduced to inspiration. It was lived, and that quiet continuity gave his thinking a human center. Years passed, then more years. The predictions that once hovered over his life slowly lost their authority. 2 years became 5, 5 became 10, 10 became decades. Time behaved differently than expected. Doctors had spoken honestly, based on patterns they knew. But life does not always follow averages. Stephen outlived the timeline that had once defined him, not triumphantly, not defiantly, simply by continuing. His body grew more fragile. Movement became minimal. Assistance became constant. But his presence did not disappear. His thinking remained sharp. His curiosity remained intact. Time, once framed as limited, became something else again. Not endless, but open. Every additional year arrived quietly. Not promised, not assumed, just present. And Stephen accepted each one without drama. In later years, his attention often returned to endings. Not personal ones alone, cosmic ones. He spoke about the future of humanity, about fragile planets, about universes expanding beyond usefulness. He considered what it means for something to end, and whether endings erase meaning. His reflections were calm, measured. He did not speak as someone afraid of disappearance. He spoke as someone who understood impermanence deeply. Nothing lasts forever. Not stars, not galaxies, not ideas in their original form. And yet, things continue. Patterns repeat, knowledge transfers, understanding evolves. Stephen seemed at peace with this. The idea that existence does not need permanence to matter. Time does not need to stop for something to have been real. Stephen Hawking died on March 14, 2018. The body that had gradually slowed finally came to rest. The world responded as it often does, with headlines, with tributes, with summaries. But something quieter was also happening. Ideas continued moving. Students remembered his words. Readers returned to his books. Questions he helped shape remained open. Time did what it always does. It moved forward. A life that once occupied a single body now existed in memory, influence, and thought. Not frozen, not preserved perfectly, but carried. Stephen Hawking does not remain as a figure sitting in a chair. He remains as attention directed toward the universe, toward questions that do not demand urgency, toward curiosity that does not require speed. And somewhere tonight, someone is thinking slowly about time, about space, about existence itself. Without realizing, they are continuing a quiet conversation that began long before them. And time, as always, continues on.